We were forged from the same cosmic fire, Inanna and I, two sparks cast from a single furnace, cooling into existence at the dawn of the universe. She was the light that caught the upward draft, rising into the celestial chorus to bask in the adoration of the stars. I was the shadow that fell away. Gravity claimed me, pulling my essence down through the layers of the void. There was no choice in the matter, only the crushing weight of a destiny written in iron. While she ascended, I drifted into the expanse where heat ceases to exist. I watched her radiance grow distant, a flickering point of warmth shrinking against the encroaching dark. My own path led elsewhere, away from the songs and the light, toward the foundations of the world. I am the silence that anchors the noise of the living. I am the dark twin, born of the same stardust, yet condemned to the silent, unyielding plane that waits beneath all things. This separation was not a mistake. It was the first law of the universe. She took the heavens, and I took the end of all paths. The descent was not a fall, it was a peeling away of reality. As I crossed the threshold of the Kur, the light that defined my existence did not simply fade. It was torn from me. I felt the connection snap, a phantom limb severed from my spirit with the brutal precision of a blade. The warmth of the stars evaporated, leaving behind a hollow space where my soul used to resonate. I reached for the light, but my fingers grasped only the static of the void. Then the silence began. It did not just surround me, it poured into the cavity left by my departed soul, filling me until I was a vessel for the abyss. Every vibration of the universe died the moment it touched this place. I was no longer the spark I had been at the dawn of time. I was the dark matter that remained. I consumed the silence, and in turn, the silence digested the last remnants of my celestial memory. I stopped struggling against the pressure. I surrendered to the weight of the iron plane, becoming the architecture of the deep, cold and absolute. I claimed the obsidian throne as my own. It rose from the iron plane, a jagged monument to the end of all things. Below me, the silence was no longer a void but a command. I began to forge the boundaries. 7 gates I raised, each built from the weight of earth and the finality of stone. They were not mere walls, they were the physical manifestation of my will. I set the laws into the ground with the force of a falling star. Anything that crosses these thresholds becomes mine. I set the gatekeepers in place, their hands resting on the rusted bolts of the locks. If a king enters, he leaves his crown in the dust. If a slave enters, he leaves his suffering behind. My decree was absolute. No shadow that passes through these arches will ever return to the light. I watched the first soul arrive, a drifting wisp of memory, and saw it stop at the outer gate. It tried to turn, to flee back to the world of warmth. The gate slammed shut, the sound echoing through the iron plane like a gavel. The law was set. The dead do not leave. They belong to the silence, and I am the hand that holds the key. The darkness of the Kur fractured. A beam of white, searing light pierced the horizon, cutting through the iron air like a jagged blade. It was not the light of a star, but the arrogance of a trespasser. Inanna had arrived. Her radiance assaulted my domain, scorching the obsidian floors and making the very shadows recoil. She walked as if the iron plane were her own garden. Oblivious to the weight of my law, I felt the vibration of her steps, each one a rhythmic insult to the stillness I had cultivated over eons. I did not rise from my throne. Instead, I signaled the first gatekeeper. The order rippled through the subterranean tunnels, a cold, silent command that froze the air. I watched the movement on the periphery of my sight. The gatekeepers moved with practiced, mechanical efficiency. They closed the distance. I felt the shift in the balance of power as they reached for her. My voice echoed through the iron chambers, a singular directive: strip her. Strip her of the symbols, the power, and the blinding pretense. Every gate she passed would demand a toll. By the time she reached my feet, She would be nothing but the shadow she believed she could conquer. The seventh gate groaned open, the sound of rusted iron grinding against stone filling the chamber. Inanna stumbled forward, crossing the threshold into the heart of the Kur. She was no longer the radiant presence that had burned my horizon. The gatekeepers had left her with nothing. She collapsed to her knees, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps that echoed against the obsidian walls. She tried to rise, her fingers clawing at the slick, cold floor, but her limbs trembled with a new and unfamiliar weakness. She was a hollow shell, shivering in the absolute zero of my domain. I leaned forward on my throne, letting the silence stretch until it became a physical weight upon her chest. She lifted her head, and for the first time our eyes locked. There was no celestial chorus here, no worshippers, no blinding light. There was only the damp, metallic smell of the abyss and the sight of her shivering, exposed form at my feet. I held her gaze, refusing to blink, forcing her to acknowledge the truth of her position. She was finally vulnerable. She was finally mine. The arrogance of heaven had been reduced to a single trembling heartbeat in the dark. I did not speak. I did not need to. I narrowed my focus, centering the totality of the Kur behind my eyes and casting the gaze of death directly into her pupils. It hit her like a physical blow. Her skin lost its final trace of color, turning the gray of cooling ash. Her chest stopped its frantic rise and fall. She went limp, a marionette with its strings severed. I signaled the shadow servants. They emerged from the obsidian seams of the floor, silent as smoke. They lifted her, heavy and unresisting, and carried her toward the iron wall. There, a great rusted hook waited, protruding from the stone like a jagged tooth. They impaled her upon it. She hung there, motionless, a piece of butchered meat in the larder of the dead. The moment her weight settled, the world reacted. A profound, hollow roar erupted from the very foundations of existence. Not a sound of wind or earth, but the deafening roar of absolute silence. It vibrated through the iron floor, climbing the walls and shaking the pillars of the sky. The balance had shifted. The light of the world was now a carcass, and the Kur was the only thing that remained. Above, the gods spiraled into a frantic, chaotic panic. Their frantic demands for her release echoed down the lightless shafts of the abyss, but I turned my back to the sky. I remained the absolute authority of the iron plane. Then, the gates groaned not from a soul entering in terror, but from a deliberate, heavy impact. A figure crossed the threshold. He did not crawl, nor did he beg. He walked with the steady, rhythmic gait of a man measuring his own territory. This was Nergal. He moved through the seventh gate, his presence bringing a subtle, impossible shift to the air. Where the Kur was absolute zero, he carried a spark of something dangerously alive. He bypassed the weeping shadows and the jagged walls, his eyes fixed solely on my obsidian throne. He did not flinch at the sight of the carcass hanging upon the wall. He did not hesitate when the freezing mist curled around his boots to stop him. He kept coming, his stride eating the distance between us. He reached the foot of my dais, stopped, and looked up. He was not a supplicant. He was an interruption. He stood there, a singular point of heat in my frozen domain, and for the first time in an eternity, the silence of the Kur felt incomplete. He sat upon the cold stone floor, not as a prisoner, but as an equal. For 6 days, the air between us became a crucible. We did not discuss mercy or the plea of the gods. We spoke of the mechanics of existence, of why the living must fear the end, and why the dead must hold the weight of memory. His words were precise, sharp, and stripped of the celestial arrogance I had come to despise. With every exchange, the frost that had encased my heart for eons began to crack. It was not a sudden collapse, but a rhythmic, persistent fracturing. I watched the obsidian floor beneath his feet. The absolute zero of my domain struggled to claim him, yet he remained, an anchor of steady, burning logic. The silence of the Kur, once a perfect, suffocating shroud, now felt porous. I found myself listening, not for the sounds of lamentation, but for the next beat of his argument. My resolve, once a fossilized monolith, was thinning. The heat he brought was not a fire that consumed, but a light that revealed the edges of my own isolation. By the sixth night, the iron air felt less like a cage and more like a threshold. I looked at him, and for the first time, the absolute law of my kingdom felt like a question rather than a decree. The seventh morning arrived, but the throne was empty. Nergal had left. The silence of the Kur rushed back to fill the space where his voice had been, but it was no longer the silence of mastery, it was the silence of a void. My domain felt hollow, the obsidian floors biting into my feet with a cold that now felt like a lack of purpose. I watched the gates. I waited. The first time I had ever anticipated an arrival that was not a soul destined for the ledger. Then, the ground trembled. Not the tremor of a collapsing ceiling, but the heavy, rhythmic thud of a stride I recognized. He crossed the threshold of the first gate, then the second, walking with the deliberate pace of a man returning to his own heart. He did not look at the shadows. He did not look at the chains. He walked straight to the dais and stood before me. He reached out, his hand steady, and touched the cold metal of my crown. He did not flinch. He did not bow. He took his place at my side, his presence anchoring the shifting stones of the Underworld. He was the only king capable of bearing the weight of this iron plane. He had returned by choice, and in that choice, the law of the dead finally found its living pulse. I look out over the iron plains, where the ledger of the dead stretches into eternity. Inanna commands the fleeting adoration of the living, the bright, noisy surface that thrives on the promise of tomorrow. But that is a surface ripple. I am the depth. I am the silence that anchors your noise. The final, inevitable point, where all lines converge. Every king, every slave, every breath taken under the sun is merely a trajectory aimed at my gates. I do not mourn this, nor do I revel in it. It is simply the mechanic of the universe. The dead do not lie. The dead do not change. In this stillness, I find the only truth that cannot be unmade. Nergal stands beside me, his weight grounding the shifting foundations of my throne. We are the final reality. The beginning gives the world its motion, but the end, my end, gives that motion its meaning. All things climb toward the light, yet all things eventually descend to me. My kingdom is the map, the boundary, and the destination. When the stars cool and the celestial chorus finally fades into nothingness, this silence will remain. It is the bedrock of everything that ever was and everything that will ever be.
Stop lurking. Start building. Like, subscribe, bell, comment your legendary take. Let's continue on the journey. This is Epic Mythos Unveiled. Thanks for watching.